Chapter 9. The Watsons Go to Birmingham, 1963. That Sunday I got up early. There weren't any cartoons on, but it was always fun to wake up and not have to worry about going to school. When I got into the living room, I was surprised to see the front door open. I looked outside and saw Dad sitting in the brown bomber. I guess he was listening to records because he had his arm across the seat and was beating his hand up and down like it was a drum. I ran back upstairs to the bedroom and changed out of my pajamas. I peeked out of the bedroom window to make sure Dad hadn't left. He was still in the car, so I ran downstairs and through the front door. I remembered and caught the screen just before it slammed. I tapped on the window and Dad turned and smiled at me, then pointed to the passenger side for me to get in. I ran around the car and climbed in. "Hi, Kenny." "Hi, Dad." "How'd you sleep?" "Okay, I guess." "Go on in and get yakety-yak and sit with me for a while." "That's okay. I'll just listen to what you're playing." We listened to a couple of jive songs, and then I said, "Dad, does Byron really have to go to Alabama? Couldn't we just drive down to about Ohio and pretend we're going to leave him to scare him?" Dad looked at me and smiled kind of slow. He reached over and turned the Ultra Glide down a little bit. "Kenneth, I know you're going to miss Byron. We all will. But son, there are some things that Byron has to learn, and he's not learning them in Flint. And the things he is learning are things we don't want him to do. Don't want him to. Do you understand?" "No." Dad turned the Ultra Glide down a little more. He looked like he was thinking whether or not he should tell me something. He was looking straight at me, and even though it was real hard, I looked right back at him. I tried to look real intelligent, and I guess it worked, 'cause finally Dad said, "Kenny, we put a lot of thought into this. I know you've seen on the news what's happening in some parts of the South, right?" We'd seen the pictures with a bunch of really mad white people with twisted up faces, screaming and giving dirty finger signs to some little Negro kids who were trying to go to school. I'd seen the pictures, but I didn't really know how these white people could hate some kids so much. "I've seen it." I didn't have to tell Dad I didn't understand. "Well, a lot of times that's going to be the way of the world for you kids. Byron is getting old enough to have to understand that his time for playing is running out fast. He's got to realize that the world doesn't have a lot of jokes waiting for him. He's got to be ready." Dad looked at me again to make sure I was understanding. I nodded. "Grandma Sands says it's quiet down where they are. But we think it's time Byron got an idea of the kind of place the world can be, and maybe spend some time down south will help open his eyes." I nodded my head again. "Mama and I are very worried because there's so many things that can go wrong to a young person, and Byron seems bound and determined to find every one of them." "Now, do you really understand why we're sending Byron to Birmingham?" "I think so, Dad." "Good, because Kenny, we've done all we can, and it seems the temptations are just too much for By here in Flint. So hopefully, the slower pace in Alabama will help him by removing some of those temptations. Hopefully, he can see that there comes a time to let all the silliness go. By'll be back, maybe at the end of the summer, maybe next year. It's completely in his own hands now." I loved when Dad talked to me like I was a grown-up. I didn't really understand half the junk he was saying, but it sure did feel good to be talked to like that. It's times like this, when someone is talking to you like you are a grown-up, that you have to be careful not to pick your nose or dig your drawers out of your butt. "Okay, Dad, thanks." He smiled again, turned the Ultra Glide back up, and ran his hand over my head. Some of the time when you think about being a grown-up, it gets to be kind of scary. I couldn't figure out how Mama and Dad knew how to take care of things. I couldn't figure out how they knew what to do with Byron. Dad? I don't think I'll ever know what to do when I'm a grown-up. It seems like you and Mama know a lot of things that I can never learn. It seems real scary. I don't think I could ever be as good a parent as you guys. Dad turned the Ultraglide back down. Kenny, do you remember when we used to go on drives and I'd put you on my lap and let you steer the car? I smiled. Yeah, does that mean I get to do it on the way to Alabama? Sure, but that's not what I meant. Do you remember how big and scary the car seemed the first time you were behind the wheel? Dad was right. Even though I knew he was watching everything real close, it still was scary to steer the brown bomber. Well, that's what being a grown-up is like. At first it's scary, but then before you realize, with a lot of practice, you have it under control. Hopefully, you'll have lots of time to practice being grown up before you actually have to do it. This was making sense to me. As far as you being a good parent, don't worry. You'll learn from the mistakes your mother and I make, just like we learned from the mistakes our parents made. I don't have a single doubt that you and Byron and Joey will be much better parents than your mother and I ever were. Dad stopped talking for a second. Besides, some of the time, we don't think we've done such a good job. But you're right, Kenneth. It can be scary, and it gets a lot scarier when you see you're responsible for 3 little lives. A lot scarier. I wanted to see if Dad was going to talk to me like this anymore, but he turned the music back up. We listened to his junk a little more, and then I said, Dad? Yeah? I've got one more question. He turned the Ultraglide down a little again and gave me a serious look. What do you want to know, Kenny? Is it too late to get yakety yak? Dad laughed and sent me to go get it. I had to promise to play it only 3 times, though. After the 3rd time, I asked, Dad, why did you buy this record player? Don't they have radio stations in Alabama? Sure they do. Lots of them, but you see, once you get south of Cincinnati, the only kind of radio station you can get is hillbilly music. You won't believe this, but if you listen to any kind of music long enough, first you get accustomed to it, and then you learn to like it. Now, your mother and I made a deal when we first got married that if either one of us ever watched the wonderful, wonderful Lawrence Welk show or listened to country music, the other one got to get a free divorce. I'm kind of used to your mother, and I don't want to have her dump me. So, instead of taking the chance I would get hooked on hillbilly music, I thought it would be wise to bring our own sounds along with us. Even though this made sense to me, Mama didn't buy it. And for the next week, while we were getting everything set for going to Alabama, she kept reminding Dad how much the Ultraglide cost and how it messed up all the plans she'd written in her notebook. Me and Joey were in the living room playing when Mama and our neighbor, Mrs. Davidson, came in. Hello, Joetta. Hello, Kenneth. Hi, Mrs. Davidson. I noticed right away that she had something behind her back. She said, Since I won't be seeing you for a while, I thought I'd give you something so you wouldn't forget about me, sweetheart. She stuck a box out toward Joey. I could kill Joey the way she opened presents. Instead of ripping the wrapping paper off, she hunted around to find each piece of tape, then peeled it off real careful. It took her about 2 days to get all the paper off and open the box. Joey finally held up her present. I didn't think Mrs. Davidson noticed, but I could tell there was something that Joey wasn't happy about. She looked at Mama real quick, and Mama looked at her. Then Joey said, Thank you very much, Mrs. Davidson. Mama smiled. Mrs. Davidson took the present from Joey and handed it to Mama. See, Willona, it's just like I told you. Look at that smile. The minute I saw it, it reminded me of Joetta. Is that her smile or what? In fact, do you know what I named this angel?" Joey pretended she was stupid and said, "No, Mrs. Davidson. I've named her after my favorite little girl. This angel's name is Joetta." I went for a closer look. Mrs. Davidson had bought Joey a little angel that was kind of chubby and had big wings and a halo made out of straw. The only thing about its smile that looked like Joey to me was that the angel had a great big dimple too. It was made out of white clay, and it looked like someone had forgotten to paint it. The only thing that had any color on it were its cheeks and its eyes. The cheeks were red, and the eyes were blue. Mrs. Davidson said, "Ooh, child, give me one more big hug before I go." Joey got up and hugged Mrs. Davidson, then took her angel and said, "I'm going to put her in my room. Thank you, Mrs. Davidson." "You're welcome, precious." Mrs. Davidson looked like she was going to cry. We all knew she'd kidnap Joey if she had the chance. She liked her that much. When Mrs. Davidson left, Mama went upstairs and into Joey's room. I eavesdropped. They were both sitting on Joey's bed. "I was very proud of the way you behaved, Joetta. What was wrong?" "The angel, Mommy." "Oh?" "Mrs. Davidson said it reminded her of me, but it didn't look like me at all." Mama looked around the room. "Where'd you put it?" "It's in my socks drawer." Joey was so neat she had a separate drawer for socks. Mama went and got the angel and sat next to Joey. "Sweetheart, I can see how it reminds her of you. Look at that dimple." "But, Mommy, it's white." Mama laughed. "Well, honey, I can't say it isn't, but an angel's an angel. What do you think?" "Maybe, but I know that angel's name isn't Joetta Watson." "Well, I'm glad you didn't hurt Mrs. Davidson's feelings. Keep the angel around. You might get to like it. Where'd you want me to put it?" "Back under the socks." Mama laughed. The only one who didn't do anything to get ready to go to Alabama was Byron. He acted like nothing was going to happen, even though Mama got a bunch of clothes together and put them in suitcases. The smelly green pine tree was hung from the rearview mirror, and all the lists and figuring were done. But Byron acted like he didn't notice. Even after a few more yelling phone calls were made to Alabama, Daddy Cool just kept being cool. Byron didn't even get nervous when Mama packed a whole bunch of food in the giant green cooler we borrowed from the Johnsons. After all of this stuff, it was finally the night before we were supposed to leave. We'd just got in bed. Byron was up in his bunk and I was down in mine. I was so excited that I was talking a mile a minute. But I was talking to myself. Byron wouldn't answer anything. Then a knock at our bedroom door. There was a knock at our bedroom door. "Come in." It was Mama and Dad. Mama said, "Lights out, Kenneth. Byron, you come with us." "What for?" "We thought since this was the last night you were going to be spending in Flint for a while, that you might like to sleep in our room tonight." "You thought what?" Byron had a way of saying stuff in a few words that made it seem like he was saying a whole bunch more. "Come on, By, you're bunking with us tonight," Dad said. "Aw, man." Byron jumped out of the top bunk and gave me his death stare. I just shrugged. I guess the grapevine had gotten back to Mama and Dad that By was going to make a prison break tonight before he got transferred to Alabama. He thought I was the snitch, but it was Joey. She knew if Mom and Dad got up in the morning and Byron had flown the coop, that he'd really be a dead man when they finally recaptured him. So I guess she saved his life by snitching. But By sure didn't appreciate it. I sneaked out of bed after Mama and Dad arrested Byron. I was too excited to sleep and too excited to read. I looked out of the window at the brown bomber and couldn't believe it was going to take us all the way to Alabama.